And so with organic soils, what we have is the idea that we have decay being greatly slowed down. So the idea that oxygen can break down and combine with things quickly in the air, but it doesn't happen when water is present. So where we're going to find organic soils happening is where we have basically waterlogged soils, and so these places are also places where decay is going to be greatly slowed down because you always have the presence of water. So there's not really that necessity for organic material to be broken down. And so then what happens is organic residue, the organic matter that would be broken down and eventually just work its way back into the soil, now just keeps accumulating and accumulating and accumulating until it becomes the dominant soil. So bogs, swamps, marshes, fens, those are all places where you're going to have this organic soil where the idea is that the organic matter has just accumulated so much that's become the most dominant part of the soil. If you've heard the term peat before, peat means that it's an organic soil that has little to no decay, whereas if you've heard muck, and people refer to soil as muck, that means an organic soil that's partially decayed. And so so that's the difference. Peat, little to no decay; muck, partially decayed. In terms of oxidation and reduction, so they're people talk about them as like a redox, so it's like a half reaction. So if you have oxidation, you need to have reduction as well to have a full reaction, because oxidation is basically the loss of electrons and reduction is the gaining of electrons. So where do we see this happening? We see this happening in respiration processes in the soil. So basically your soil microorganisms will produce electrons when they consume food. What does that mean? So aerobes specifically are going to be using the food. They're going to eat the organic matter in the soil. And when they eat that organic matter in the soil and it combines with the oxygen, they're going to then give off CO2. Well, how do they give off CO2? Well, what happens is the electrons that were in the organic matter that were in the carbon, they transfer from the carbon to the oxygen, and that's how you end up with CO2. Is that they leave the carbon, but then the oxygen will grab them right up. And an easy way to think about oxidation and reduction is to think of the term oil rig. So oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So oxidation, you're losing electrons; reduction, you're gaining electrons. And so where do we see this? Iron is one of the minerals that's most commonly oxidated. So you get iron oxides in the soil, and that's why in this picture right here we get this really red colored soil here. Sometimes it's a brownish red, sometimes it's this very orangish red. It just depends. Here we see a more of a brownish red, but iron being the most commonly oxidized mineral element. Other ones could be magnesium, sulfur, aluminum, or chromium. And then it's going to go anywhere from a yellowish brown to a reddish color. Any soils that aren't oxidized would be more of a light colored or more grayish colored soil. Cementation. So where do we see cementation? You see that when weathered products are leached from one horizon and accumulate in a lower one. And so what does that really mean? Well, it's something that's actually common in the Central Valley, where it's the idea that materials are going to leach through the soil, but when they leach down through the soil, they're actually going to bind together with other soil particles and form a hard layer, which is called a pan. So you hear people talk about the hard pan, or they're digging down to the hard pan, and we basically have this layer that almost forms back to rock. And it's a really hard soil. It becomes really difficult to deal with. I've tried to dig through hard pan myself, and it just seems like an exercise in frustration because feels like you're digging into rock. and that's cementation. You can also have this happen through other ways of compaction. One thing to think about is if you're running cattle and say you have a like a water trough or a watering area, and the cattle take animals are kind of specific in the way they do things, so they're going to take like the same route over and over again to get to the watering area. And what you have is you end up with soil compaction in that walking path for the animals. And then what you'll end up with is what's called a traffic pan, which is you have this same thing happen where the materials are just going to basically leach through the soil, and then your soil gets compacted, and it ends up forming this hard pan underneath there. And so even though it might not be happening right in the other areas right next to that soil, but because you keep getting that that traffic in that area, you can end up with one of these hard pans. Here's another example of it. There's your soil over the top, and then you got this cemented hard pan layer right there underneath it. And that's what I've got. So big things to focus on: the 5 factors of soil formation. What are they? How did why are each of them important in the soil formation process? The ideas of weathering, physical and chemical weathering, and then some of these other processes, the accumulation of organic matter, cementation, those sorts of things. Just the idea of how soil forms. And then where we'll take it now is to see, okay, so this is how the process of soil forming starts happening. Now what else can we figure out? And that's where I'll leave you.